The clash of steel against steel rang through the mountain passes of Thrace, where winter winds carried the sounds of battle and the scent of blood. Dawn painted the sky in hues of amber and crimson, as if the heavens themselves were bleeding for what was to come. Spartacus moved like a demon through the Roman ranks, his sword singing a deadly song that had already claimed 8 legionaries. Their bodies lay in the frost-covered grass, steam rising from cooling flesh into the bitter morning air. The Thracian warriors' movements were poetry written in violence, each strike a calculated verse, each parry a carefully measured refrain. His blade found gaps in Roman armor with surgical precision, seeking the vulnerable flesh beneath bronze and iron. Blood sprayed across his face, mixing with the sweat that froze in his beard, but he paid it no mind. The battlefield was his element, the dance of death his oldest companion. "Hold the line," he roared to his fellow tribesmen, his voice carrying over the cacophony of combat. "Push them back to the ravine. Make them fight uphill." The strategy was sound. Force the Romans to battle gravity as well as Thracian steel. Every advantage counted against Rome's endless numbers. Beside him, Nicholas, his childhood friend and most trusted warrior, dispatched a Roman centurion with a brutal thrust through the throat. "They came prepared this time, brother," he shouted, already engaging his next opponent. "Too many for a simple raid." Spartacus knew he was right. The Romans had brought 3 full cohorts, excessive for putting down what they claimed was a simple tribe of mountain brigands. This was different. This was methodical. This was extermination. Steam rose from the bodies of the fallen, their blood melting the early morning frost. The Romans had come at dawn, their armor gleaming like a serpent's scales in the pale light. They'd expected to find a sleeping village. Instead, they'd found warriors ready for battle, warned by Spartacus's night scouts. Through the chaos of combat, Spartacus caught glimpses of his people's desperate defense. Old men who had long ago laid down their swords now took them up again. Women fought with the fury of mother bears protecting their cubs. Even the children played their part, running messages between groups of defenders, carrying water and arrows to those who needed them. A young Roman officer pushed through his men, his cape crimson like the blood staining the ground. Unlike his troops, he moved with the grace of a trained swordsman, his blade an extension of his arm rather than a mere tool of death. Their eyes met across the battlefield, a moment of recognition between 2 men who understood the art of war. "Your men fight well, Thracian," the officer called out in accented Greek, parrying a thrust from one of Spartacus's warriors and ending the man's life with elegant efficiency. "Surrender now, and I'll ensure they're treated with honor." Spartacus spat blood onto the frozen ground, his breath forming clouds in the cold mountain air. "We are not animals to be bartered with, Roman. You come to our lands, burn our homes, and speak of honor?" He punctuated his words by intercepting a legionary's blade and sending the man's head rolling across the frost-covered earth. The officer nodded, as if he'd expected nothing less. There was something in his eyes, not quite respect but understanding. "Then you leave us no choice." He raised his sword, signaling to unseen forces. Too late, Spartacus heard the horns from the ridgeline. A second Roman cohort had circled behind them while they'd been occupied with the frontal assault. The perfect pincer movement. He would have admired the strategy if it wasn't about to destroy everything he loved. "Sura!" he shouted, searching for his wife among the defenders. Through the chaos of battle, he caught sight of her atop the village's wooden watchtower. She had been coordinating the village's evacuation, her voice rising above the din of combat to direct the elderly and children toward the hidden mountain paths. Their eyes met across the carnage, her fierce gaze always his anchor in the storm of battle. She stood like a Thracian goddess of war, her dark hair whipping in the winter wind, bow singing death to any Roman who ventured too close to the escaping villagers. Each arrow found its mark with deadly precision, her aim as true as her heart. She had been a hunter before becoming a warrior's wife, and those skills now turned Roman soldiers into prey. "Go," she mouthed, notching another arrow to her bow. "Lead them out. I'll hold them here." But before he could move, the world erupted in fire. Roman artillery had found its range, and flaming projectiles arced through the morning sky like falling stars. They crashed into the wooden structures of the village, turning their homes into an inferno. The watchtower took a direct hit, and Spartacus's heart stopped as he watched Sura leap from the burning structure, rolling through the snow to extinguish the flames that caught her clothing. The young Roman officer seized his chance, pressing forward with a fresh wave of troops. "Take him alive," he commanded. "The Thracian is worth more breathing than dead." Spartacus fought with renewed fury, each movement a lesson in lethal efficiency. A thrust through a legionary's throat, a slash that opened another from hip to shoulder, a shield bash that crushed a Roman skull against a tree trunk. But even as he fought, his mind raced through possibilities, seeking an escape route for his people. "Nicholas," he called to his friend, "take the hidden paths, lead them to the caves." He caught a glimpse of his old friend nodding, already gathering the remaining warriors to protect the retreating villagers. The Romans pressed their advantage, their discipline unwavering even in the face of Thracian savagery. Spartacus felt the tide turning, felt the noose of Roman tactics tightening around them. Yet he fought on, each movement a defiance against inevitability. A Roman shield wall advanced like an iron wave, pushing him back step by step. He recognized the tactic. They were isolating him from the other defenders, cutting him off from any hope of escape. The young officer directed his men with hand signals, orchestrating Spartacus's capture with the precision of a poet crafting verse. "Your reputation does you justice, Thracian," the officer called out, genuine admiration in his voice. "Rome could use men like you." Spartacus's response was a thrown dagger that the officer barely deflected with his shield. "Rome uses everything and everyone, Roman. That is why you must burn and steal and kill, because you can create nothing of your own." The officer's face hardened. "Take him." They came at him from all sides, shields interlocked, spears bristling like a deadly forest. Spartacus fought like a cornered wolf, each strike meant to kill rather than wound. A spear grazed his ribs, drawing first blood. He grabbed the shaft, pulled the wielder forward, and drove his sword through the man's face. Another legionary fell to a sweeping cut that severed his legs at the knees. A third lost his arm at the elbow. But even wolves can be overwhelmed by numbers. A shield bash caught him in the ribs, driving the air from his lungs. As he stumbled, a sword pommel struck his temple with calculated force. The world spun, colors bleeding into one another like wet paint. Through the encroaching darkness, he saw Sura being dragged away by Roman soldiers, her struggles fierce but futile. She fought like a wild thing, breaking one soldier's nose with her elbow, biting another's hand to the bone. But for each Roman she fought off, two more took his place. Her screams echoed in his mind as consciousness fled. "Spartacus, I will find you. I swear by all the gods I will find you." The darkness took him then, and he fell into a void filled with fire and screams and the iron taste of defeat. He woke to the bite of iron around his neck and wrists, the rhythmic creak of wagon wheels his only companion. The proud Thracian warrior had become Roman property, another piece of flesh to be sold in the markets of Capua. His body was a map of pain, bruised ribs, torn muscles, and the throbbing headache from the blow that had ended his freedom. The wagon rolled through mountains and valleys, each league taking him further from everything he had ever known. Other captured warriors lay in chains around him, some weeping silently, others staring with dead eyes at the canvas covering that hid the sky from view. But Spartacus's eyes burned with an inner fire that no chains could extinguish. As the wagon rolled south toward slavery, Spartacus made his own oath, binding as any blood sacrifice to the old gods. Rome had taken everything from him, his freedom, his wife, his people. They had destroyed his world with mechanical efficiency, turning proud warriors into livestock for their markets. He would take everything from Rome in return. Each league toward Capua was a lesson in patience, each rattle of his chains a reminder of the debt that would be paid in full. They thought they were bringing another slave to their precious games. Instead, they were forging the weapon of their own destruction. First, he would survive. Then he would learn their ways, their weaknesses, their arrogant belief in their own invincibility. And when the moment was right, he would show them that chains could become weapons, that slaves could become warriors, that the mighty Roman Republic could be brought to its knees by the very people they had tried to break. He touched the iron collar around his neck, feeling its weight, its crude craftsmanship. One day, It would be melted down and reforged into a sword. And with that sword he would carve his name into the flesh of Roman power. Until then he would wait, he would watch, he would plan, and he would begin with their precious games. Iron gates groaned open like the maw of an ancient beast, swallowing Spartacus into the darkness of Batiatus's ludus. The morning sun cast long shadows through the barred windows, painting stark lines across the sand-strewn training yard where blood and sweat had mingled for generations. The air itself seemed to pulse with old violence, thick with the copper tang of spilled blood and the acrid stench of fear. Doctor, the trainer of gladiators, stood like a statue carved from obsidian, his dark skin scarred by countless battles, his whip coiled at his side like a sleeping serpent. His eyes, sharp as a blade's edge, assessed each new slave with the calculated precision of a merchant weighing gold. When his gaze fell upon Spartacus, something flickered in those ancient depths, recognition, perhaps, of a kindred warrior spirit. "Strip them," Doctore commanded, his voice resonating through the courtyard. "Let's see what Rome has brought us." The guards moved with practiced efficiency, cutting away the filthy rags that had been the slaves' only protection during their long journey. Spartacus stood proud, his shoulders straight despite the chains that still bound him. The morning light revealed a map of old scars across his muscled frame, testament to a life of battle long before Roman chains. Quintus Lentulus Batiatus descended from his villa's balcony, a cup of wine already in hand despite the early hour. His rich toga seemed to absorb the morning light, making him glow like a petty god surveying his domain. Behind him walked his wife Lucretia, her red hair blazing like fresh blood in the sun. "Ah, the Thracian," Batiatus said, his cultured voice carrying notes of both refinement and predatory interest. "They say you killed 8 men before they could subdue you. Impressive, if true." He circled Spartacus like a wolf sizing up potential prey. But killing in battle is one thing. Killing in the arena, that's an art form. Spartacus met his gaze with unflinching defiance. "I do not kill for your entertainment." The whip cracked, its tip biting into Spartacus's back with precise fury. Doctore moved like lightning despite his size. "You kill when, where, and whom the ludus commands," he growled, "or you die. That is the only choice slaves possess." Blood trickled down Spartacus's spine, but he didn't flinch. In the corner of his eye, he caught movement. Other gladiators watching from the barred windows of their cells. Among them, a massive Gaul with hair the color of wheat fields leaned forward, interest sparking in his savage eyes. "Crixus," Batiatus called out. "Come, show our Thracian friend what it means to be a gladiator of the house of Batiatus." The Gaul emerged into the training yard, his movements containing the fluid grace of a natural killer. He was larger than Spartacus, his body honed by years of gladiatorial combat. But it was his eyes that commanded attention, calculating, intelligent, burning with ambition barely contained beneath a veneer of submission. "Wooden swords," Doctor commanded, tossing practice weapons to both men. "First blood only. We test his skill, not his life. Yet." Crixus struck like a thunderbolt, his wooden sword whistling through the morning air. But Spartacus was already moving, his body remembering the rhythms of combat, even as his muscles screamed from weeks of confinement. The practice weapons crashed together with enough force to send splinters flying. "Good," Doctor's voice cut through the sound of combat. "The Thracian has proper form, but form alone does not make a gladiator." The 2 men circled each other, their feet raising small clouds of dust from the well-worn training ground. Spartacus recognized the predatory grace in Crixus's movements. This was no common arena fighter. The Gaul had transformed himself into something else, something that straddled the line between warrior and performer. "In the arena," Crixus spoke in heavily accented Latin, "it is not enough to kill." He launched a complex series of attacks, each strike flowing into the next like water. "You must make them love you for it." Spartacus parried, countered, his mind absorbing the lesson even as his body responded to the threat. Each exchange taught him something new about this strange world he'd been thrust into. The way Crixus played to an imaginary crowd, even in practice. The subtle flourishes that turned efficient killing moves into spectacular displays. From the balcony, Batiatus watched with growing interest. "The Thracian learns quickly," he mused to his wife. "Perhaps we've found something special." "Or another corpse for the graves," Lucretia replied, her eyes never leaving the combat below. "The arena breaks more men than it elevates." The fight intensified, wood cracking against wood with increasing fury. Sweat poured down both men's bodies, making the sand beneath their feet treacherous. Crixus pressed his advantage in size and experience, driving Spartacus back with a relentless assault. But Spartacus had not survived countless battles by strength alone. He read the pattern in Crixus's attacks, noted how the Gaul favored his right side, perhaps nursing an old injury. When Crixus launched another spectacular combination, Spartacus didn't try to match him. Instead, he dropped and rolled, coming up inside the Gaul's guard. The wooden sword stopped just short of Crixus's throat. Silence fell over the training yard. Even the other gladiators watching through their bars held their breath. Crixus's eyes met Spartacus's, and something like respect flickered in their depths. "Enough!" Doctore's voice shattered the moment. "A promising display, but promise means nothing without discipline." His whip cracked again, this time between the two men. "Crixus, return to your cell. Thracian, you will begin training immediately." What followed was an education in pain. Hours of basic sword drills under the burning sun. Endless repetitions of footwork patterns in the sand. Each mistake earned another kiss from Doctor's whip, until Spartacus's back was a lattice of burning lines. But it was the evening meal that taught him the most about his new world. In the communal eating area, hierarchies became clear. Crixus sat apart, surrounded by a small group of elite gladiators. Others clustered in groups based on their origin, Gauls with Gauls, Germans with Germans. A dark-skinned man with intelligent eyes made space on his bench. "Asher," he introduced himself as Spartacus sat, "I handle certain arrangements for the ludus. It would be wise to cultivate friendship." Before Spartacus could respond, another voice cut in. "Ignore the Syrian snake." A massive German warrior dropped onto the bench opposite them. "I am Varro, once a Roman citizen, now a gladiator by choice rather than chains." "By choice?" Spartacus's voice carried equal parts disbelief and curiosity. "Gambling debts," Varro explained with a self-deprecating smile. "The arena offers a chance to earn both coin and freedom, assuming we live long enough." As the night deepened, Spartacus learned more about the complex world he'd entered. The gladiators were not mere slaves, but valuable commodities, trained at great expense. Victory in the arena could bring privileges, better food, wine, even women. Enough victories could earn freedom. But it was the quiet conversations that interested him most. The whispered grievances, the subtle undercurrents of discontent. Even here in the heart of Roman power, seeds of rebellion took root in fertile soil. In his cell that night, lying on the hard pallet that was now his bed, Spartacus began to plan. The Romans had taught him something valuable, how to turn men into weapons. But they had forgotten an essential truth: weapons could be turned against their masters. He thought of Sura, wondering if she still lived, if she searched for him as he yearned for her. The pain of separation was a physical thing, sharper than Doctore's whip, but he would channel it, use it. Each day in this place would forge him into something newer and deadlier than the Romans could imagine. "Tell me about your wife," Varro's voice came from the neighboring cell. "I see you touch the empty space on your finger, where a ring would be." Spartacus was silent for a long moment. "She is the fire that keeps me warm in this place," he finally replied. "The thought of her burns brighter than any arena glory." "Then survive," Varro said simply. "Survive and fight, and become what they want you to be. But never forget who you really are." The words followed Spartacus into his dreams, where he fought endless battles against faceless Romans, always searching for Sura among the crowd, always waking with her name on his lips and revenge in his heart. Days bled into weeks, his body transformed, muscles hardening under constant training. He learned the ways of different weapons: sword, spear, trident, net. Each one became an extension of his will, a tool in his growing arsenal. But more importantly, he learned to read men. Crixus's pride and ambition, Asher's cunning manipulations, Doctore's hidden honor beneath his brutal exterior, Batiatus's desperate hunger for recognition and status. Each piece of knowledge was a weapon more valuable than any sword. The day of his first arena fight approached, like an oncoming storm. The ludus buzzed with speculation about which of the new recruits would survive their blooding. Bets were placed, favorites chosen. "Remember," Doctor told them during their final training session, "in the arena, you are more than men. You are legends in the making. The crowd does not want to see slaves die. They want to see gladiators live gloriously." That night, as the ludus settled into uneasy sleep, Spartacus made his own sort of prayer, not to the gods of his homeland or the gods of Rome, but to something older and deeper, the eternal spirit of defiance that lived in the hearts of all enslaved men. He would survive. He would rise. He would become the legend they wanted. And then he would show them how legends could burn entire worlds to ash. The holding cells beneath Capua's arena smelled of fear, sweat, and destiny. Torchlight flickered across stone walls stained by generations of blood, casting writhing shadows that seemed to mock the men waiting for their moment in the sun. Somewhere above, the crowd roared like a living beast, hungry for violence. Spartacus sat in meditation, his mind calm despite the chaos around him. Beside him, Varro paced like a caged lion, nervous energy radiating from every movement. Over the past months, the two men had forged a bond stronger than mere friendship, a brotherhood born of shared pain and silent understanding. "My son turns 8 today," Varro said suddenly, his voice barely a whisper. "Numerius. I promised to buy him a wooden sword when I earned enough from the games." He laughed, but there was no joy in it. What kind of father teaches his son to glorify this? Spartacus opened his eyes, studying his friend. Varro had been teaching him to read and write Latin in the quiet hours between training sessions, opening new worlds of knowledge. In return, Spartacus had shared stories of Thrace, of freedom, of a life where men chose their own destiny. "You fight to free yourself from debt," Spartacus replied. "There is honor in that." "Honor," Varro spat the word. "There's no honor in killing for Roman pleasure. We're all just meat in a butcher's shop waiting for our turn under the knife." Before Spartacus could respond, Doctor's voice cut through the tense air. "First match, Spartacus and Varro against the beasts of Carthage." The guards opened their cell, checking their weapons one final time. The swords were real this time, not the wooden practice blades of the ludus. Death would be real too. "Together then, brother?" Varro's nervous energy had transformed into focused determination. Spartacus clasped his friend's forearm. "Together. Watch the left flank. I've seen these Carthaginians fight. They favor ambush tactics." The gates opened and sunlight struck them like a physical blow. The roar of the crowd became deafening as they stepped into the arena, their feet sinking slightly into sand stained red by countless battles. Across the oval space, another set of gates opened, disgorging their opponents. 3 massive Carthaginians, their dark skin decorated with ritual scars, their eyes burning with the same desperate need to survive. "Remember what I taught you," came Doctor's final advice. "Make them love you." The arena sand burned beneath their feet as Spartacus and Varro moved in perfect synchronization, a deadly dance practiced countless times in the training yard. The Carthaginians circled like wolves, their curved blades catching the sunlight. The crowd's roar faded to a distant thunder as battle focus took hold. "For my son," Varro whispered, his grip tightening on his sword. "For freedom," Spartacus responded, and then the world exploded into violence. The largest Carthaginian attacked first, his blade describing a murderous arc toward Varro's throat. But months of training under Doctore's lash had transformed both men. Varro parried with precise economy, creating an opening that Spartacus exploited with lethal efficiency. First blood painted the sand as Spartacus's sword opened a shallow cut across the Carthaginian's ribs. The crowd's roar shifted from bloodlust to appreciation. They recognized skill when they saw it. The remaining Carthaginians abandoned subtlety for brutal, direct assault. Blades clashed with enough force to shower sparks, each impact sending shockwaves up arms already burning with effort. Spartacus felt the old battle joy rising, that terrible ecstasy of combat that transformed pain into fuel for greater efforts. "Like fighting mountain lions back home," he called to Varro, ducking under a slash that would have taken his head. Varro laughed, the sound incongruous with the violence around them. The mountains of Thrace must be interesting places. He punctuated his words by catching a Carthaginian's blade with his own, turning the man's momentum against him. They fought as one organism, covering each other's blind spots, creating openings for each other to exploit. When Spartacus stumbled in the blood-slicked sand, Varro's shield deflected a killing blow. When Varro was driven back by a furious assault, Spartacus's sword found their opponent's hamstring. The first Carthaginian fell to a perfectly timed combination, Varro's shield bash staggering him backward, Spartacus's blade finding his heart. The crowd erupted in approval, their bloodthirst momentarily sated. But arena battles were never simple affairs of mere combat. Politics and entertainment intertwined like serpents in a mating dance. As the remaining Carthaginians pressed their attack with renewed fury, Spartacus caught sight of Batiatus in the Pulvinus, the special section reserved for prominent citizens. The lanista was deep in conversation with a richly dressed Roman, their gestures suggesting business being conducted even as men died below. "They bet on us, you know," Varro grunted, parrying a vicious thrust. "Like children playing with dice, except the dice are made of flesh and blood." Something shifted in the air, a subtle change in the rhythm of combat. The Carthaginians had been herding them, Spartacus realized too late, separating them with carefully calculated attacks, forcing them apart. "Varro!" he shouted in warning, but the trap was already sprung. The second Carthaginian fell to Spartacus's blade, but the third had maneuvered Varro into position. The Roman-turned gladiator's foot caught in a depression in the sand, a crater left by previous combat, concealed by the blood-darkened dirt. Time seemed to slow. Spartacus saw it all with crystal clarity. Varro's stumble, the Carthaginian's blade descending, the look of surprised recognition in his friend's eyes, as he realized this might be his final moment. But Varro was more than just another gladiator. He twisted as he fell, turning what should have been a killing blow into a glancing wound. His own sword thrust upward, finding his attacker's throat. Both men fell, blood mixing with the arena sand. The crowd exploded in appreciation of the spectacle, not understanding that the drama below was more than mere entertainment. Spartacus reached Varro as the Carthaginian's corpse was dragged away, already assessing his friend's wound. "It's nothing," Varro gasped, though the blood seeping between his fingers said otherwise. "I've had worse shaving." The victory was celebrated with wine and women, the traditional rewards for pleasing the crowd. But in the quiet hours of night, in their neighboring cells, the two men spoke of deeper things. "I never thanked you," Varro said, his voice thick with more than wine, "for teaching me to see this place clearly. I came here thinking I could buy back my honor with blood. Now I understand that honor can't be purchased, it can only be lived." "Save your thanks for when we both earn our freedom," Spartacus replied. "Your son needs his father, not your ghost." Victories followed victories. Spartacus and Varro became favorites of the crowd, their synchronized fighting style drawing spectators from as far as Rome itself. The Ludus' fortunes rose with their success, and Batiatus rewarded them with small privileges. Better food, occasional visits from Varro's wife and son. But with success came danger. Other gladiators grew jealous, particularly Crixus and his followers. Political currents shifted in Capua's upper circles, creating new pressures and demands. And always there was the shadow of death, waiting for any moment of weakness. The day everything changed began like any other. Another arena battle, another crowd baying for blood. But this time, something was different. Spartacus sensed it in the way the guards avoided their eyes, in the unusual tension radiating from Batiatus's lanista box. "A special match," Doctore announced, his voice carrying an unfamiliar edge, "one that will be remembered." They entered the arena separately this time, Spartacus from the eastern gate, Varro from the western. The crowd's roar held a note of anticipation, as if they knew something the gladiators did not. Understanding dawned like a knife to the gut. They wanted them to fight each other. "Brother," Varro's voice carried across the sand, pitched for Spartacus's ears alone. "Remember your promise. Remember what we fight for." The battle that followed was both real and artificial, a dance of blades between men who knew each other's moves as well as their own. They had to make it look convincing while avoiding serious injury, a delicate balance of skill and theatrics. But something was wrong. Spartacus saw it in Varro's eyes, in the subtle hesitation before each strike. His friend was fighting with an intensity that spoke of finality rather than preservation. "What are you doing?" Spartacus hissed during a blade lock that brought them close together. "Saving my family," Varro whispered back. "They promised to clear my debts to provide for my wife and son, but only if—" He didn't need to finish the thought. The realization hit Spartacus like a physical blow. This was never meant to be a mock battle. This was execution disguised as entertainment. "No," he growled, but Varro was already moving, launching an attack that left him deliberately exposed. Spartacus's body responded with trained reflexes before his mind could stop it. His sword found the opening, an opening Varro had intentionally created. Blood sprayed across the sand. "Thank you, brother," Varro gasped as Spartacus caught him, "for teaching me what freedom really means." The crowd's roar was distant thunder, meaningless noise against the sound of his friend's final breath. Spartacus held him as his life ebbed away, their brotherhood sealed in blood on the arena sand. That night, in the silence of his cell, Spartacus made a new oath, not just for Sura now, but for Varro, for every soul broken by Roman greed and cruelty. The rage in his heart crystallized into something harder than steel and colder than a mountain winter. Rome had taken everything from him, piece by piece. First his freedom, then his wife, now his brother. They would learn, too late, that they had been forging their own destruction. Every loss, every pain, every indignity was fuel for the fire that would consume them all. The rebellion's seeds, watered with Varro's blood, began to grow. Rebellion, like an avalanche, begins with subtle movements, tiny shifts that go unnoticed, until the mountain itself begins to roar. In the weeks following Varro's death, Spartacus moved through the ludus like a ghost, his silence more terrifying than any rage. The guards watched him with nervous eyes, mistaking his quiet for submission. They did not understand that his very stillness was the calm before a storm that would shake the foundations of Rome. It began with whispers in the night, cell to cell, slave to slave. Spartacus wove a web of promise and vengeance. His words, carried on midnight breezes, spoke of more than mere escape. They painted visions of a world where every slave could stand as a free man beneath the sun. "They believe us tamed," he murmured through the bars to Crixus, the Gaul's massive frame shrouded in darkness. "They think the arena has broken us, turned us into creatures that live only for their entertainment." Crixus shifted, moonlight catching the scars that mapped his battles across his flesh. "And what makes you think I would trade certain glory for uncertain rebellion?" "Glory?" Spartacus's laugh held no mirth. "Tell me, champion of Capua, what glory is there in killing your brothers for Roman pleasure? How many more Varros must die before we remember what it means to be men rather than animals in their games?" The words struck home. Spartacus saw it in the way Crixus's shoulders tensed, in the subtle clench of his jaw. The Gaul had his own ghosts, his own memories of brothers fallen in the arena's blood-soaked sand. Each night brought new converts to their cause. Agron and Duro, the German brothers whose fierce loyalty to each other reminded Spartacus painfully of his own lost brotherhood with Varro. Raskos, a brutal fighter whose hatred of Rome burned hot enough to forge weapons. Even Asher, the clever Syrian, who had always seemed more interested in survival than rebellion, began feeding them crucial information about guard rotations and weapon storage. But it was Doctore who proved the most challenging to approach. The trainer's honor was legendary, his loyalty to the ludus seemingly unshakable. Yet Spartacus saw something in the old gladiator's eyes when he watched the newer recruits die in training, a flicker of pain quickly masked by disciplined indifference. "They call this honor," Spartacus said one evening as they cleared the training yard of bodies. 3 recruits had died that day, their blood darkening the sand. To throw lives away like copper coins in a beggar's cup. Doctore's whip remained coiled at his side, but his hand tightened on its handle. "The weak die. That is nature's law." "We were not born to be weak or strong," Spartacus countered, his voice low and intense. "We were born to be free. Everything else is just the chains they have placed upon our minds, as surely as the iron around our wrists." Days passed, and the rebellion took shape in subtle ways. Kitchen knives disappeared one by one, carefully hidden in cells. Gladiators began practicing formations during training that could be used for more than arena spectacles. The Germans manufactured crude weapons from broken training equipment, while Asher's network of informants mapped every corner of the ludus. Even the house slaves were drawn into the web of conspiracy. Mira, a dark-eyed serving girl who brought water to the gladiators during training, became their eyes and ears within Batiatus's villa. She reported on guard patterns, on which soldiers were likely to be drunk during their watch, on where weapons were stored. "Why help us?" Spartacus asked her one day as she poured water into his cup, her movements deliberate and graceful despite the guard's watchful eyes. "Because I have seen too many good men die for Roman pleasure," she whispered, her eyes never leaving her task. "Because every night I must endure their hands on my body and smile as if it is an honor rather than a violation. Because even a quick death in rebellion is better than a long life of such shame." The words struck him like physical blows, reminding him of Sura, of every indignity she might have suffered in Roman hands. His grip on the water cup tightened until his knuckles turned white. Each small victory, each new recruit, each hidden weapon was a spark added to the timber of their rebellion. But it was Crixus's final commitment that transformed spark into flame. The goal came to him in the deepest part of night, when even the guards dozed at their posts. "You spoke of being men," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I have been their creature for so long I had forgotten what that meant, no more." Spartacus clasped his former rival's arm. "Together, then? The Thracian and the Gaul?" "Together," Crixus nodded. "But know this, if we fail, it must be in a way that makes the Romans tremble at the very mention of our names." The final piece fell into place when Doctore appeared at Spartacus's cell one night, his dark face unreadable in the shadows. For a long moment, the trainer said nothing, simply studying the man who had become the heart of this brewing storm. "I have watched men die in this place for 20 years, he finally spoke, each word weighted with decades of suppressed pain. "I told myself it was the natural order, that I was teaching them to die with honor. But there is no honor in this place. There is only waste and the slow death of everything that makes us human." He uncoiled his whip, the symbol of his authority, the tool that had drawn blood from every gladiator in training. With deliberate movements, he began unraveling its leather length. "Within this whip," he explained, "is a steel core thin enough to pick any lock in the ludus. I had it made years ago, telling myself it was insurance against treachery. In truth, I think I was waiting for a man worth following." Freedom began with the changing of the guard. Third watch, when the moon hung heavy in the sky and even the most vigilant eyes grew heavy with exhaustion. The scattered thunderstorm that had threatened all evening finally broke, its rumbling masking the sound of Doctor's whipcore picking the first lock. Cell by cell, the gladiators emerged like shadows given form. Each man moved with deadly purpose, bare feet silent on stone floors worn smooth by generations of enslaved warriors. The crude weapons they had gathered over weeks of preparation felt strange in hands accustomed to proper gladiatorial arms, but desperation made them deadly nonetheless. Spartacus led them with the calculated precision that had made him legendary in the arena. His mind transformed the ludus into a battlefield, each corridor a potential kill zone, each intersection a tactical opportunity. The rain drumming against the roof above created a rhythm that matched his heartbeat, the pulse of approaching revolution. "The armory first," he whispered to the assembled men, their faces grim in the darkness. "Then we split into 3 groups. Crixus takes the barracks, Doctore the villa. I'll lead the assault on the guard tower." Lightning illuminated the courtyard in stark bursts, turning falling rain into silver threads. The first guard died without a sound, Spartacus's kitchen knife opening his throat with surgical precision. The second had time for half a shout before Agron's improvised club crushed his skull. But it was the guard captain who proved why he held his position. Despite being roused from sleep, he emerged from his quarters with sword in hand and veteran's instincts screaming warnings. His blade caught the torchlight as he parried Spartacus's thrust, steel ringing against makeshift weapons. "I knew you were trouble, Thracian," he snarled, his skilled sword work keeping multiple attackers at bay. Should have put you down like the dog you are." Spartacus moved like water, each strike flowing into the next. "You should have remembered," he replied, his voice deadly calm, "that even dogs bite when cornered." The fight was brutally short. The captain was skilled, but he faced men who had nothing left to lose, who had trained daily in the art of dealing death. When he focused on blocking Spartacus's attack, Crixus's blade found his liver. As he staggered, Doctor's whip snaked around his neck. The snap that followed was lost in another roll of thunder. With the captain's death, organized resistance crumbled. Guards who had been cruel masters moments before became panicked prey, hunted through their own domain by the very men they had tormented. Some fought, some ran, some tried to surrender. In the end, it mattered little. The rage of freed slaves proved as indiscriminate as the storm above. Batiatus's villa became a slaughterhouse. The lanista died cursing them, his fine robes soaked with wine and blood. His wife Lucretia's screams were cut short by Crixus's blade, personal vengeance for crimes known only to them. House slaves who had been abused joined the rebellion with savage joy, turning their intimate knowledge of the villa's layout into a deadly advantage. When dawn finally broke, it illuminated a transformed world. The ludus that had been their prison now became their fortress. Bodies were cleared away, defenses organized, weapons distributed. Former house slaves tended to wounds, while gladiators secured the perimeter. The first taste of freedom was flavored with blood and rain. Spartacus stood on the balcony where Batiatus had once watched them train, his eyes scanning the horizon. Soon Rome would learn of their rebellion. Soon legions would march. But for now they had won their first victory. "They will come with everything they have," Crixus said, joining him at the balcony. "Let them come," Spartacus replied, his voice carrying across the courtyard where freed men were already preparing for war. "We were their greatest entertainment. Now we become their greatest nightmare." In the days that followed, the ludus transformed. Training resumed, but now they trained for war rather than spectacle. Crixus and Doctore drilled men in real combat tactics rather than crowd-pleasing moves. The Germans, led by Agron, fortified the walls and gathered supplies. Asher's network of contacts brought news and weapons from the city. More importantly, word spread. Slaves began arriving in ones and twos, then in groups. Each brought stories of Roman cruelty. Each carried their own burning desire for vengeance. Spartacus welcomed them all, turning their raw hatred into disciplined fury. "We are no longer gladiators," he told the growing army one evening, his voice carrying across the packed courtyard. "We are no longer slaves. We are the fire that will burn Rome's corruption to ash. We are the storm that will sweep away their empire of chains. And when they write of this rebellion, they will remember that it began here with us, with the unquenchable human desire to live free or die trying." The roar that answered him shook the very foundations of the ludus. It was the sound of chains breaking, of men remembering what it meant to stand tall, of a rebellion transforming into something that would shake Rome to its core. In his quarters that night, Spartacus unrolled a map of the region. Their next moves would determine everything. They needed more weapons, more supplies, more men. But more than anything, they needed to show other slaves that rebellion was possible, that the mighty Roman Republic could bleed. He touched the empty space where his wife's token should have been, feeling Varro's absence like a physical wound. "Watch over us, brother," he whispered to the night. "The storm we dreamed of is finally breaking." Outside, rain continued to fall, washing away the blood of their first battle. But darker storms gathered on the horizon. Rome was stirring, her legions preparing to march. The real war was about to begin. History remembers moments of profound transformation, not in the language of facts and figures, but in the thunder of heartbeats and the coppered taste of fear. On the plains of Lucania, where morning mist clung to the earth like the shrouds of future dead, 50,000 Roman legionaries faced 40,000 former slaves across a field that would soon become legend. Dawn painted the world in shades of amber and blood, as if the very sky anticipated the carnage to come. The air held that peculiar stillness that precedes storms and slaughter, heavy with the metallic ring of drawn steel and the quiet prayers of men contemplating mortality. Spartacus sat astride his warhorse, a magnificent black stallion captured from a Roman cavalry officer, his presence drawing every eye like lodestones to true north. The morning light caught the scars on his armor, each mark a testament to battles survived and brothers lost. Gone was the arena fighter who had once performed for Roman pleasure. In his place sat a general who had transformed a handful of escaped gladiators into an army that had brought Rome herself to the precipice of panic. Crixus guided his mount alongside, the massive Gaul's scarred face set in its familiar fierce grin. "Their numbers have grown since our scout's last report," he observed, his voice carrying the quiet certainty of a man who had already accepted his fate. Crassus must have forced-marched the Western Legion through the night. "Numbers are not everything," Spartacus replied, his eyes scanning the Roman lines with the tactical precision that had kept them alive this long. "We have something they can never understand." "And what is that?" "Nothing left to lose." The rebel army stretched across the plain like a dark tide, ready to break against Roman shores. Near the center, Agron and his brother Duro completed their final equipment checks, the ritual familiar after countless battles. The German warriors had come far from their days in the Ludus. Agron now commanded the rebel army's left flank, while Duro led their best scouts. "Remember when our greatest concern was surviving the day's training?" Duro adjusted his borrowed Roman breastplate, his fingers tracing a dent that might have ended its previous owner's life. Agron's laugh carried an edge of bitter memory. "Simpler times, though I don't recall you doing much surviving without my help." The familiar jest masked deeper emotions. Every battle could be their last, and both brothers knew it. "I've grown since then," Duro replied, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned experience. "We all have." Nearby, Doctore, who still refused to answer to his birth name despite being free, moved among the troops with the same commanding presence that had terrorized gladiator recruits. His whip remained coiled at his side, but now it was a symbol of choice rather than bondage. Former house slaves and gladiators alike drew strength from his calm certainty. "Remember your training," his voice carried over the pre-battle tension. "The Romans expect to face untrained rabble. Show them what the house of Batiatus truly taught us." The morning wind carried hints of approaching rain, the dark clouds gathering like spectators to the impending clash. Among the troops, Asher moved with his characteristic fluid grace, whispered conversations and meaningful glances marking his passage. The Syrian had proved invaluable in gathering intelligence, though few fully trusted him. "Their left flank is anchored by the 3rd Legion," he reported to Spartacus, his pointed face animated with urgent purpose. "Fresh troops, but their commander is young, more concerned with glory than tactical sense." Spartacus absorbed the information with a nod. Every piece of intelligence could mean the difference between victory and annihilation. "And Crassus?" "Commands from the center, as expected. 3 rings of elite guards plus a cavalry reserve." Asher's eyes flickered briefly to the Roman lines. "He seeks personal glory as much as victory. If you fall, he wants it known that his blade did the deed." A horn blast from the Roman lines sent birds scattering from nearby trees. The sound rang across the battlefield like the voice of Mars himself calling for blood. In response, thunder rumbled from the approaching storm. Crixus rode up, his massive frame seeming to dwarf his mount. The Gaul's armor was a patchwork of Roman and tribal pieces, much like the army he helped lead. "They're moving their artillery forward. It begins soon." Spartacus surveyed their assembled forces one final time. Former house slaves gripped spears with white-knuckled determination. Gladiators who had once fought each other for Roman amusement now stood shoulder to shoulder. Farmers, merchants, even a few defected Roman soldiers, all brought together by the dream of freedom. "Take your positions," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had remade himself from slave to legend. "Remember why we fight, not for glory, not for vengeance, for a future where no child is born into chains." The rebel army moved with surprising discipline, a testament to months of hard training. Each unit knew its role in the complex strategy they had developed. It wasn't enough to simply fight Rome. To have any hope of victory, they needed to break them. Across the field, the Roman army began its own preparations. The sound of 50,000 men moving in unison carried like the approach of an earthquake. Their artillery, massive ballista and Scorpio, were being wheeled into position. Archers nocked arrows, cavalry checked girths and lance straps. The first Roman volley came not with a command, but with the mechanical precision of practiced warfare. Hundreds of ballista bolts and flaming projectiles arced through the morning sky like angry stars falling to earth. The sound they made cutting through the air was like the breath of death itself, a whispered promise of destruction. "Shields!" Spartacus's command rolled down the rebel lines. Thousands of captured Roman scuta rose skyward, creating an iron ceiling against the death raining from above. The impact was devastating despite their preparation. Wood splintered, men screamed, and the neat lines of the rebel army became spotted with gaps where soldiers fell. But they held. A cheer went up from the surviving rebels, their first small victory against Rome's might already won. Spartacus knew better than to let them celebrate. "Form ranks," he commanded. "They come." The Roman infantry advanced with the precision of a machine, their ordered lines a stark contrast to the more fluid rebel formations. Thousands of iron-shod sandals struck the ground in perfect unison, creating a rhythm like approaching thunder. Red cloaks and chrome helmets caught the morning light, making the legion seem to glow with divine purpose. Crixus's voice carried over the din, pitched to reach his Gaul warriors in their native tongue. "Let them come. They think their pretty formations make them invincible. Show them how free men fight." On the left flank, Agron and Duro led their German contingent in a traditional war chant, the guttural sound sending chills through friend and foe alike. The brothers had positioned their forces behind a subtle rise in the ground, one of many tactical advantages Spartacus had chosen in selecting this battlefield. "Hold!" Spartacus's command kept the rebel army in check as the Romans advanced. Every instinct screamed at them to charge, to meet the enemy head-on. But they had learned discipline in the hardest school imaginable. They would fight Rome not just with courage, but with cunning. The distance closed. 300 paces. 200. The sound of Roman boots became a physical thing, shaking the earth. At 100 paces, their front ranks leveled their pila, the heavy javelins that had conquered half the known world. Archers! At Spartacus's command, hidden troops rose from the tall grass on both flanks. They had spent hours concealing themselves there in the pre-dawn darkness, and now that patience paid off. Hundreds of arrows blackened the sky, striking the Roman formation at an angle their shields weren't positioned to defend. The Roman advance faltered. Their perfect lines wavered as men fell, as gaps appeared in their formation. This was the moment Spartacus had planned for. "Now!" His sword described an arc of gleaming steel in the morning light. "Show them the price of tyranny!" The rebel army surged forward like a wave breaking against rocks. But this was no chaotic charge. They moved in coordinated units, each group targeting specific points in the Roman line. Gladiators led each spearhead, their arena-honed skills transformed into battlefield lethality. The armies met with a sound like the end of the world. Steel rang against steel. Men screamed war cries that turned to death rattles. Blood painted the ground in abstract patterns as two fundamentally opposed forces tried to erase each other from existence. Spartacus fought like a god of war come to earth. His sword found gaps in Roman armor with surgical precision, each stroke a death sentence. Years of arena training combined with natural skill and desperate necessity to make him virtually untouchable. Soldiers who had fought barbarians and elephants broke before his onslaught. Nearby, Crixus lived up to his reputation as the undefeated Gaul. His massive sword carved space around him, each swing ending a Roman life. He fought with controlled fury, his arena showmanship replaced by brutal efficiency. "For freedom!" he roared in his native tongue, the cry taken up by warriors around him. The battle dissolved into 1,000 individual conflicts, each man fighting his own private war within the larger struggle. Blood turned the ground to crimson mud. The morning air grew thick with the copper tang of death. The first major turn of battle came not with grand strategy, but with a brother's desperate cry. Agron saw the danger too late. A Roman cavalry unit had found a gap in their lines, wheeling toward where Duro led a charge against the legion's flank. The morning sun caught their spear points like distant stars, promising swift death. "Duro!" Agron's voice carried over the cacophony of battle. raw with desperate urgency. He cut down 2 legionaries blocking his path, his blade finding gaps in their armor with practiced precision. But the distance was too great, the press of combat too thick. His brother turned at the sound, but the warning came too late. The Roman cavalry struck like a thunderbolt, lances lowered, horses' hooves churning the blood-soaked earth. Duro managed to raise his shield, deflecting the first strike that would have taken his life. But the cavalry's momentum shattered his formation, isolating him from his men. Agron fought like a man possessed, cutting a bloody path through the Roman lines. Each stroke of his sword was a prayer, each fallen enemy a step closer to his brother. Time seemed to slow, stretching like heated metal, as he watched Duro face what seemed like an entire cavalry squadron alone. The younger German's blade danced with deadly grace, claiming 2 Romans before they could wheel their mounts. A third fell to a well-aimed thrust that found the gap between breastplate and helm, but numbers and momentum proved unstoppable. A lance took Duro in the shoulder, spinning him into the path of another rider. No! Agron's roar was primal, rising above even the din of battle. He reached his brother as Duro fell, catching him before he could hit the ground. Blood soaked through leather and cloth, hot against Agron's hands. Should have listened better. In training, Duro managed, his attempt at their old jest turning into a wet cough. Save your strength, Agron commanded, as if force of will alone could keep death at bay. Around them the battle swirled like a maelstrom, but a small pocket of calm had formed, Agron's men holding back the Romans in a defensive circle. Win this fight, Duro's voice was barely a whisper now. Win it for all of us. His eyes focused on something distant, something beyond the battlefield's carnage. I can see our homeland, brother. The foresters, they're so green. The light left Duro's eyes between one heartbeat and the next. Agron felt something break inside him, not just grief, but the last chains of civilization. He laid his brother's body gently on the bloody ground, closed those sightless eyes with trembling fingers. Then he stood, and the Romans learned what it meant to face a man with nothing left to lose. Agron's fury transformed him into something more than human. His sword became a living thing thirsting for Roman blood. Each stroke was a death sentence, each movement an expression of grief turned to lethal purpose. The Romans who had killed his brother died screaming, their disciplined formation breaking before his onslaught. Across the battlefield, similar dramas played out with tragic intensity. Asher, the clever Syrian who had played both sides throughout the rebellion, found his schemes had finally caught up with him. Trapped between advancing Roman lines and rebels who had discovered his latest betrayal, he fought with the desperate cunning of a cornered rat. "I can still be of use," he called to Spartacus, parrying a gladiator's thrust while backing toward the Roman lines. "There are secrets you don't yet know." But it was Crixus who answered, the massive Gaul's sword ending years of manipulation with a single stroke. "The only truth that matters," he growled as Asher fell, "is written in blood." The storm that had threatened all morning finally broke, turning the battlefield into a nightmare of mud and blood and desperate struggle. Lightning split the sky, illuminating tableaus of violence frozen in brilliant clarity. Agron still fighting like a demon possessed, surrounded by a growing ring of Roman dead, Doctor leading a desperate defense of their center line, Crixus driving deep into the enemy's right flank. Thunder rolled across the plain as Crassus committed his reserves, fresh troops who had watched their comrades die, their discipline hardened by anger and shame. They struck the rebel lines like a hammer falling on heated steel, threatening to shatter everything Spartacus had built. "Hold the line!" Crixus's voice carried over the storm's fury. The Gaul had transformed from arena champion to true leader, his natural warrior spirit now tempered by months of command. "Give ground if you must, but make them pay for every step." The rebels fell back in relatively good order, using the muddy ground to slow the Roman advance. But it was a fighting retreat, and everyone knew such movements could turn to rout with frightening speed. This was the moment that would determine if they were truly an army or just a mob playing at war. Doctor saw the danger first. The Roman advance was not uniform. It pushed harder on the flanks, trying to encircle the rebel army. If they succeeded, it would be a slaughter. The old trainer's tactical mind, honed by years of preparing men for combat, saw only one solution. "Spartacus," he called, his voice cutting through the chaos. They mean to close the trap. We must counter now or lose all. Spartacus saw it too. The complexity of real battle was far removed from arena combat, but certain principles remained the same. Sometimes survival required sacrifice. "Crixus," he called to his longtime rival and brother in arms, "take our best fighters. Drive through there right before they can complete the encirclement. Make them remember the day they fought the undefeated Gaul." Understanding passed between the two men. This was not just a tactical command, but a farewell. Crixus's fierce grin flashed in the stormlight. "Try not to win this war without me, Thracian." What followed would be sung of in rebel camps for generations. Crixus gathered his most devoted followers, many fellow Gauls who had fought beside him since the Ludus break. They formed a wedge of death, with their champion at its tip. Lightning caught their weapons as they charged, making them seem like gods of war descended to earth. The Roman line buckled under their assault. Crixus fought with the accumulated skill of countless arena victories and months of rebellion. His sword opened paths through Roman armor that should have been impossible. Men who had trained their entire lives in legion discipline fell before his fury. But even legends can bleed. A pilum caught Crixus in the thigh, slowing his deadly dance. Still he fought on, each stroke a masterpiece of violence. A sword blow glanced off his helmet, leaving him half-blind with blood in his eyes. Yet his counter-strike claimed the attacker's life. The Romans recognized the threat he posed. A tribune rallied his men specifically to bring down this warrior who dared defy Rome's might. They came at him from all sides, discipline overcoming individual fear. Crixus's last moments were glory incarnate. Bleeding from a dozen wounds, he still fought with the skill that had made him champion. Each Roman that came within reach of his sword joined him in death. His final words, roared in his native tongue, were captured by surviving witnesses. "Death is but the beginning of legend." A Roman sword finally found his heart, but not before he had carved his name into history. The rebels who survived would tell of how he died standing, taking 3 more legionaries with him before his mighty frame finally fell. The storm that had threatened since dawn now dominated the sky, as if the gods themselves watched the unfolding tragedy with tears of thunder and lightning. In the wake of Crixus's fall, the battlefield became a canvas painted in shades of loss and desperate courage, where every breath could be a warrior's last. Doctore saw it first, the subtle shift in Roman tactics that threatened to undo everything they had fought for. Through the curtain of rain, he watched as elite units began moving to exploit the gap Crixus's death had created. His tactical mind, honed by decades of training men for combat, calculated the geometric certainty of their doom if something wasn't done. "The formation splits here," he called to Spartacus, his voice carrying over the storm's fury. "If they complete the maneuver, they'll cut us in half." Spartacus finished, reading the battlefield with the same lethal precision that had kept him alive in countless arena fights. Doctore's scarred face creased in a grim smile. "Then we must give them something else to concern themselves with." He touched the whip at his side, no longer a symbol of servitude but a reminder of transformation. The house of Batiatus taught us well, did it not? Understanding passed between the men. Some sacrifices were necessary for the greater victory, a lesson they had learned in the harshest school imaginable. "You were more than a trainer," Spartacus gripped his old mentor's forearm. "You were the father many of us never had. And you were the son who made me remember what honor truly means." Doctor's voice held the weight of decades. "Now let me show these Romans what the Doctor of Capua can do when he fights for a cause worth dying for." He gathered 100 of their best fighters, men who had trained under his lash, who knew his every command. Among them were veterans of a dozen arena battles, each one a deadly artist in their own right. They formed up with the precision he had drilled into them through countless hours of training. "Remember," his voice carried to them one final time, "you are gladiators. When they speak of this day, let them say we died standing as free men." The charge that followed became instant legend. Doctor moved like a force of nature, his whip singing death to any Roman who came within its reach. The weapon that had once enforced slavery now became an instrument of liberation, its steel core finding gaps in Roman armor that should have been impossible to exploit. A tribune fell to his blade, the man's surprised expression frozen forever, as his head left his shoulders. A centurion's charge ended in a gurgling scream as the whip coiled around his throat with surgical precision. Every movement was a lesson in the art of death, every strike a masterpiece of violence. The Romans fell back before his onslaught, their disciplined lines buckling under the fury of a man who had spent his life preparing others for battle and was finally unleashing his own martial genius. Lightning caught the arc of his whip, making it seem like he wielded Zeus's own thunderbolt. But even legends bleed. A pilum found its mark in his shoulder, but he fought on. A sword opened his side, yet still he advanced. Each wound was answered with Roman blood, each step forward paid for in enemy lives. Through the chaos of combat, Spartacus watched his old mentor's final dance. Doctore had positioned his men perfectly, drawing Roman forces away from their attempted encirclement. The sacrifice was already serving its purpose, buying time for the rebel army to reform its lines. Doctore's last stand came against a full century of legionaries. Bleeding from a dozen wounds, he still fought with the skill that had made him legendary among gladiators. His whip claimed 3 more lives before a sword finally found his heart, yet even then, he did not fall. "Remember," he gasped, his final words carrying to those close enough to hear. "We were slaves once, but we die as free men." He fell as he had lived, standing tall, his whip still coiled for one last strike, his face set in an expression of fierce pride. The Romans who finally brought him down would speak of his courage in whispered tones around campfires for years to come. The storm intensified, as if nature itself mourned the falling of giants. The battlefield had become a nightmare of mud and blood, where every step could mean death. Visibility dropped to mere yards, forcing both armies to fight in a world reduced to immediate threats and desperate survival. Agron, still berserk with grief over his brother's death, led a countercharge that drove back the Roman left flank. His sword had not stopped moving since Duro fell, each stroke a prayer of vengeance, each killed Roman an offering to his brother's shade. Through it all, Spartacus fought with the calculated precision that had made him legend. His mind transformed the chaos into patterns, reading the flow of battle like a text written in blood and steel. He saw how the Romans adjusted to each rebel movement, how Crassus directed his forces with sophisticated tactical understanding. The Roman general had proven himself a worthy opponent, not some political appointee playing at war, but a true strategist who had studied the rebel army's methods. His countermove spoke of careful preparation, of countless hours spent analyzing reports of previous battles. "He's trying to draw us in," Spartacus called to his surviving lieutenants, waiting for us to commit fully before springing his final trap. The rebels had lost nearly half their original force. Crixus was gone, Doctore had fallen. Each death was a weight added to Spartacus's soul, each loss a reminder of the terrible price of freedom. Yet still they fought on, because the alternative was a return to chains. Lightning split the sky as Spartacus made his final decision. He gathered his most trusted warriors, those who had been with him since the Ludus, who had survived countless battles by his side. Among them was Agron, his fury now contained into something more tactical but no less lethal. "One last charge," Spartacus told them, his voice carrying over the storm's rage. "Not for glory, not for vengeance, for everyone who died, believing that freedom was worth any price." They moved through the rain like ghosts, their formation tight despite the treacherous footing. Spartacus led them not toward the Roman center where Crassus waited, but toward their right flank, the opposite of what the Roman general would expect. The attack caught the Romans mid-maneuver. Spartacus's sword opened throats and severed limbs with practiced efficiency, each movement economical and lethal. Beside him, Agron fought with controlled fury, his brother's death transformed into cold, tactical precision. But Crassus proved why he had risen to command. The Roman general read the attack's purpose almost instantly, redirecting his reserves to counter the threat. The clash that followed shook the earth beneath the combatants' feet. Spartacus found himself fighting back-to-back with Agron as Roman forces threatened to overwhelm them. The German warrior's sword claimed lives with mechanical regularity, while Spartacus moved like water through Roman defenses. "They say you cannot kill a legend," Agron growled as he parried a centurion's thrust. "Then let us give them a legend worth remembering," Spartacus replied, his blade finding the gap between a legionary's helmet and breastplate. The battle reached its crescendo as the storm peaked. Lightning turned the battlefield into a tableau of frozen violence. Men caught in the act of killing and dying, their faces masks of determination or fear or fury. Thunder rolled across the plain like the voice of angry gods. Spartacus saw his chance when Crassus committed his final reserves. The Roman general had shifted his position, leaving himself momentarily exposed. It would mean certain death to attempt to reach him, but that had never stopped Spartacus before. "For freedom," he whispered, the words lost in the storm's fury. Then he moved. His charge through the Roman lines was poetry written in violence. Each stroke of his sword opened Roman throats or found gaps in their armor. He fought with everything he had learned, arena skills, battlefield tactics, and the desperate courage of a man who knew he was already dead, but refused to fall before his task was done. Crassus saw him coming. The Roman general proved his worth by standing his ground, sword drawn, rather than retreating behind his guards. Their eyes met across the narrowing distance, warrior recognizing warrior, each understanding that this moment would echo through history. Their blades met with a sound like destiny. Crassus fought with the skill of expensive tutors and natural talent, each movement technically perfect. But Spartacus fought with the accumulated knowledge of countless life-or-death struggles, where a single mistake meant extinction. "You could have been Rome's greatest general," Crassus said as they traded lethal strikes. "I would rather be freedom's greatest martyr," Spartacus replied, his sword drawing first blood. The duel that followed became instant legend. Both men were already wounded, exhausted from hours of combat, yet they fought with skill that made hardened veterans stop to watch. Their swords wove patterns of death in the rain, each strike potentially fatal, each parry a fraction from disaster. Spartacus felt the wound before he saw it, Crassus's blade slipping past his guard to find his side. The pain was distant, unimportant. He had fought through worse. His counterstrike opened the Roman general's defenses, allowing him to land a blow that would have killed a lesser man. But numbers and fate could not be denied forever. A Roman arrow found its mark in Spartacus's thigh. A spear grazed his shoulder. Each wound slowed him slightly, each drop of blood lost, bringing him closer to his final moment. Yet still he fought on. His sword claimed 3 more lives before a pilum finally found his chest. Even then, he remained standing, his blade moving in ever slower arcs of defiance. "A worthy enemy," Crassus acknowledged as Spartacus felt his strength failing. "Rome will remember you." "Rome will fear me," Spartacus corrected, his voice strong even as blood stained his lips. "For I showed them that even the lowest slave can shake the foundations of their empire." His last thoughts were of Sura, of Varro, of all those who had died in the name of freedom. He saw them waiting for him in whatever lay beyond, their faces proud of what he had accomplished. With his final breath, he spoke words that would echo through centuries. "Death is not the end. So long as one person dreams of freedom, we are all unconquered." The rebellion did not end with Spartacus's fall. Thousands of former slaves fought on, preferring death to a return to chains. Agron led a breakout that allowed many to escape into the mountains, where they would trouble Rome for years to come. History would record the rebellion's defeat, but something more important had been proven. Spartacus and his followers had shown that the human spirit could not be forever chained, that even the mighty Roman Empire could be brought to the edge of disaster by those it considered property. In the centuries that followed, whenever oppressed people dreamed of freedom, they would remember the gladiator who defied an empire. His name became synonymous with rebellion against tyranny, his story a reminder that no power, however great, was beyond challenge. The storm finally broke as night fell over the battlefield. Among the dead and dying, Roman soldiers claimed to see something impossible. A wolf standing guard over Spartacus's body, its eyes reflecting the lightning's fire. By morning, it was gone, and with it, the body of the rebel leader. Rome would never find his remains to display in triumph. In death as in life, Spartacus remained unconquered. His final victory was not on the battlefield, but in the hearts of all who dreamed of freedom. The legend had ended, but the dream lived on. In the years that followed, Rome would face other rebellions, other challenges to its power. But none would shake its foundations like Spartacus and his army of former slaves. They had proven that the mightiest empire in history could bleed, that its legions could be defeated, that its pride could be humbled. More importantly, they had shown that freedom was not just a word, but a force that could transform slaves into warriors, survivors into legends. The name Spartacus became a whispered hope in Ergastula throughout the empire, a reminder that chains could be broken. History would record their defeat, but the truth was more complex. For in showing that rebellion was possible, Spartacus had achieved something greater than military victory. He had planted the seeds of liberation in the fertile soil of human courage, seeds that would grow through centuries of oppression to flower wherever people fought for freedom. In the end, that was his greatest victory. Not the battles won or the armies defeated, but the eternal truth he had proven with his life and death, that the human spirit, once awakened to the possibility of freedom, could never truly be enslaved again. The storm passed, but its echoes would resound through history, whenever and wherever people dared to stand against tyranny and proclaim, "I am Spartacus."